ahead and get started then. Um, so this chapter is all about using historical knowledge as evidence. Um, and this has been a fun chapter to read because I think I learned the most in here because it talks about all the different areas of the country and some of the stuff but I had no clue about, right? Because I haven't surveyed in those areas. So this is where I really kind of need everyone's participation that, you know, talk about specific history in your area, I guess, as we go through the book. It's either that or we just kind of go through each state and look at some history stuff there. But I think this is kind of the coolest part of surveying, right, is knowing the history and you get into certain areas and you see a surveyor's name and you just know that surveyor, oh, that's great, that I can trust it, easy to do, you know, they do a great job, I can retrace their survey. And we definitely, particularly in some of the older original surveys, right, you see a crew's name or a company's name or a surveyor and you're like, okay, this survey is going to suck. It's going to be a challenge here from here on out, and that's the history of it, right? Like if I have not done, I mean, I've done a couple surveys in California, but you know, I went out there and did the field work, and responsible charge surveyor did it. But if I go out there, there's so much in California, and I say it because we've got a lot of California guys on the call. You know, I have no clue what I'm doing, right? And we talked a few weeks ago about how Texas does theirs, and you go over to Texas, it's a whole other system, you know, and so you've got to know the history of that. You've got to know, you know, like in the Salt Lake Valley, we're a giant bowl. So when they came and did our original surveys, there's two things that happen. We've talked a little bit about the old Mormon pioneer lot and block systems. So those first towns that are in here were just that, lot and blocks, and they had their own monuments and centerline monuments and block monuments. And you know, then the surveyors come in and they set their section corners, and half those section corners fell in someone's house, right? So they didn't set them, and so you've got this disparity in time and history of how do you survey in this portion of the town, and once you get outside of that portion of town, you have a whole other method of surveying. Um, but you've got to know that. You don't know that unless you've been around here to do that. I did a survey in North Dakota along a reservation boundary, and the reservation went in before the township surveys came in, and they missed it by like 300 feet. And I'm looking for the reservation boundary, and I'm missing it by 300 feet, but I'm hitting a monument, and I'm freaking out about how I'm finding a monument, but I'm missing it by that much. And start talking to people in the know and the history of it, and they missed the township boundary, which was supposed to be the boundary for the reservation. So I thought we could kind of just get the discussion started and kind of talk about histories in your areas, stuff you guys know about, unique things. And then as we talk about that, we'll draw some of the examples of the book. But I think just a good jumping off point here for the first half of the kind of the session is let's just swap stories and share some experiences and challenges that we've had and use that to kind of inform how we go through the chapter. Anyone want to share any experiences or challenges they've had, unique stuff that you have to know the history about?
Well, I'm in Wisconsin, and we're a PLS state, and the only other thing that we've had are some French grants along Green Bay and Prairie du Chien. So we're pretty much unexciting here.
Any insight on the French grants? How, you know, I again, I've surveyed in Wisconsin, but I didn't survey any of the French grant areas, so I don't have any clue on that. But what
Now,
makes those unique or challenging?
they were mostly along waterways, along the bay and along the Wisconsin and Mississippi River. And for the most part, they're extremely long and narrow lots. They may be 20, 30, or even 40 feet wide in some cases, but literally hundreds of feet deep. So everybody will have a little bit of water frontage.
Okay.
We have a good mix of things here in Southern California because we have your usual public lands, and then prior to that, there's a lot of Spanish rancho grants, which have senior rights to public lands. And then what happened afterwards, some of the landowners that bought up the Spanish ranchos decided to subdivide them in a similar fashion to public lands, and they've even used the same nomenclature as public lands, but they're not officially public lands. So you kind of have to watch whether you're on really BLM patented public lands or if you're in these quasi-public lands, because the monumentation may be treated a little bit differently. So it's almost, I've never surveyed in meets and bounds states, but it's, the ranches are all mapped by maps and or legal descriptions that are just random meander lines where as they establish the rancho boundaries. So just generally knowing the history of how everything came to be is a pretty important in understanding how you're going to slice and dice it.
So you're saying ranchos, is that different than like a Spanish land grant?
They're
Or
Spanish land grants, yeah.
okay.
Well, I'm also in California, PLS state, and we have standard parallels. And the thing you get into, any one that was surveyed before 1855 fell under the 1851 Oregon Manual, and you treated the closing corners from the north going south, and the standard corners were coming from the south going north. Then in 1855, when they came out with the manual of instructions for that everybody seems to fall under, they flip-flop that. So you got to know when you're working on these standard parallels, what are the standard corners and what are the closing corners, and they can get you can get messed up with it quite bad.
And we have 3 initial points in at our San Bernardino Basin meridian. We have a initial point. The initial guy set a point, went, and I think he did public land surveys on the south part. When he was finishing the survey, he couldn't find his beginning point, and ended up setting a new one. And then some 20, 30, 40 years later, as the north side got surveyed, I don't remember where this guy started, but he also couldn't find a beginning point, so he set a third one. And now the way it works is one of the points has been completely retired because nobody ended up using it. One of the points is governing everything south of standard parallel, and the western point, I believe, governs everything to the north of standard parallel. And they're all about 200-300 feet apart from one another.
And are there
So-
interesting closing corners on that where those two meet?
You know what? I actually haven't had a project, cross my fingers, in that spot. I don't know if anybody else has. So that can kind of throw you off if you're working in the area and don't know the history.
Yeah, there's a single section corner just about 20 minutes north of where I am that's had 3 or 4 different positions, and all the monuments have been taken out. It's kind of a construction type area, like a work yard for a construction company. So they are always getting bumped and taken out. But if you were to come up here and pull a tie sheet or pull a survey, like you don't really know, because a lot of the surveys just call whatever corner they used and went with it. So if you pulled a survey and tried to tie to it, you may not actually hit it because you don't know which of those 3 monuments they used for that survey. They've never been very clear, but you don't know it unless you're there in it. we have anyone else from any other states or maybe a meets and bounds states talk about history? And Brian?
I can give you a little bit. I let me preface this by saying that I'm licensed in 3 states. I'm actually from Ohio, so I could throw a monkey wrench into this entire process. Only because we've got Virginia Military District, we've got, which is meets and bounds, and then the start of all of PLS, or the public land system itself in the first place, multiple different versions of it. I primarily survey in Virginia Military District in kind of like the Southwest Ohio area. I'm licensed in Kentucky and Ohio. But I will also, like I said, preface this by saying that I've been doing mostly construction layout for most of my career. So I haven't done a whole lot of boundary work. And that's the reason why I wanted to be a part of this group. And I've been trying to like log in when I can. The problems have become that California to Ohio, it's like family time in Ohio. So it's a lot more difficult to get into this. But yes, I've always wanted to like broaden my boundary relationship and kind of make my career a little bit more. So yeah, I live in an area that has every different version of what you guys are talking about, and then some.
I've surveyed in Ohio, Columbus and areas north and then south towards Jackson there, and I know the challenges that you're talking about because it is unique. Again, I was just field guy. I'm not licensed out there and wasn't responsible to charge, but it was interesting to start going through deeds. And the thing I got to hand it to them though, any of the deeds that were in like the right on the border of the military district and the non-PLS areas, the deeds were wonderful. I had no clue what they were talking about. They were calling out to great Granny Annie's property back in 1820. You had to figure out who it was back then. But I've never seen more well-written deeds that had no information in them, because you could totally start seeing the picture. And instead of just north, south, east, and west like our PLSS states, they painted a picture of what that land was doing and where it was going and the intent of it. A lot of that, what I had to retrace, was actually a lot simpler, though us PLSS guys can't wrap our heads around that sometimes.
The good thing about it out here, if you're in the Virginia Military District, a lot of people don't like it because there is a little bit of ambiguity. The good part about it is there's some ambiguity. So you're actually listening to not necessarily expert testimony. You're talking to the people that surround it and what they think the property lines are. So you're getting a lot more agreements between neighbors. Or if there's a fight, you just do your best and you kind of make something up. And I mean, I don't want to say make it up, but it is truly, you're taking your best guess from the information that's presented to you, and you're throwing it down on paper. The next surveyor that comes along is most likely going to agree with you because, I mean, there's nothing else to go on. So just continuation of fixing problems, it works out well.
Great.
What is a military district? I'm not familiar with that term.
So when the war, let's see, the Civil War was occurring, not the Civil War, when we was gaining our, what am I trying to say? We was gaining our independence. Our military was mostly from Virginia. So what they did, they gave most of their generals land in Ohio. That's where they was giving their generals land to own. Tiffin was coming through and he was basically saying, he was surveying off ground for these generals and saying, okay, you get this amount of land. Looks like he's pulling it up here.
Right. Got it. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this
It was
is a
just
great.
from creek line to creek line, or river to river to tree kind of thing.
I think that's a great point to just jump over to the book for a second here and just look. I mean, we're talking about Ohio. That's specific enough there that the book's actually got a whole section on it, subdivision of Ohio lands. right? Although Ohio is considered a GLO state, it has many meets and bounds elements in its history. Since the main Ohio lands were ceded by Virginia and other colonies into the public domain, the grants that had been made by the original colonies had to be honored by law. Ohio was the testing ground for the new untested system of public land surveys. A large part of Ohio was public domain subdivided by the early U.S. rectangular system. The Seven Ranges was the beginning of a great American experiment, and its evolution can be followed westward across the state. Other systems used in Ohio were a result of large purchases, military reservations, and Western Reserve of Connecticut, French grants, Indian treaties, and other circumstances. Undoubtedly, Ohio has more variety in survey systems than any other public domain state. At least 20 different and distinct systems can be found. So we've got the Virginia Military District, Ohio Company Purchase, the Donation Trust, French grants, Symes Purchase, Western Reserves, United States Military District, and Northwestern Ohio.
I think I'll pass on surveying in Ohio.
Most people say that. But that's also why
Job
most
security.
people we also kind of stay in our little areas because that's what you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get out to some of these western states, and you can almost jump anywhere without respect to history because you're dealing with the same PLSS system. But you get out in the Midwest, and you do have a lot more regional surveyors, right? Counties, let's call them county surveyors, people that just kind of cover their county and maybe the surrounding counties don't go much further than that. Anyone else with history or stories to tell? Anyone else that's out east has some different experiences, or maybe down south that would want to share with us?
We'll go back to California. We have the San Andreas Fault. And that's, I've done several surveys across the fault line and tying in section corners and not finding section corners because of the movement. Last survey I did, I contact Lance Bishop for Bureau of Land Management. And he just told me to go, go from corner to corner you have and then set your corner, which, I used his advice, set it and moved on, but it does cause a problem.
So how much movement do you see? I'm curious.
You have two plates. You're dealing with the North American plate and Pacific plate. One's moving 1 inch northerly a year, and the other one's moving 1 inch southerly a year. So you're getting 2 inches.
2 inches.
Depends on which side you're working on. When you go
But
across,
you're working both sides, right?
Yeah, you're crossing the line. When they ran the government surveys back in the 1870s across it, and you have to look at, I think let's look at 82 feet north of where the straight, coming across on a tying just two corners in and doing double props. I've double prop, setting corners and and then you go north, you start looking, and I've not found anything because they set cedar post and deposited a stone. Now a stone can be just a rock with an X in it, just underneath the cedar post that is now gone because they've rotted off or the fires have burned them off. You can't find the evidence. It's there, but you just can't find it. So, and you just do what you can.
I just finished a project in Ridgecrest where we had the latest big earthquake, or one of them, and there are points that have had up to a couple of feet of movement. I know Ridgecrest was close to the epicenter of one of the earthquakes, and there's some areas that have had up to 6 or 7 feet of movement.
Yes, Connie, I was working in Ridgecrest. I just hadn't finished the survey before the earthquake, and I was, reviewing all the data, and then the earthquake happened, and I went back out to gather more data, and I had to start the whole survey all over again because things had moved.
Yeah.
Right, tie it back in.
Yeah, we're right on a highway. What is it, 175, 178, something like that? And
Yeah, 178.
Yeah, those concrete monuments, the sea monuments that Caltrans has been setting in 1940s. They some of them are a nice straight line, and then you run into an area where they just offset a little bit and then continues on. Yeah.
That blows my mind. That's so crazy. I just can't
That is
imagine.
interesting.
We deal with fault lines. Like I just recorded a plat that we had to show the fault line delineation on the plat because the geotech was done and it's affected setbacks, but never actually had to deal with the movement of it. It's just that's cool. I mean that's really cool, right? I think I started telling you, but I think I got distracted in my rant there. But so again, Salt Lake Valley is a big bowl. They surveyed the easy part first, and they went to the bases of the mountains, and then they surveyed the mountains, and it doesn't quite line up, and there's a lot of issues here. So you have to know the history of where you're at. I've pulled up on the screen here, kind of they're going like way back in this book here, and this is kind of cool. But I'm going to throw it out here, trying to get the discussion going. Does this even matter? Like what the book is talking about and looking at the Egyptian history of land surveying, and I mean we tout this as surveying's the oldest profession and it dates back clear to here, and how cool is surveying, but you know what can we glean from learning about this? Does it matter to us, or we should be looking more recent and kind of skip over this part of the book as a teaching source? Curious your guys' thoughts on that.
I think it's important from a historical perspective. I think that it should be taught as a separate course within a curriculum so people know a little bit about the history of where we come from as surveyors and how man has always endeavored to measure what he has control of and how he uses those measurements to build some of these pretty fantastic structures that they built back then, going back to the pyramids and that type of thing. When I did my short presentation that I do on the public land survey system in my intro surveying class at the university here, we talk about the public land survey system not just as a survey system, but as it laid down the transportation, the government, and the school infrastructure for as this country developed. If you don't understand that, then you're missing a big part of why that system exists to begin with. So I think it's really important that we learn this. And then some of these things, just talking about different parts of the country here and the influences that these other cultures had on the way common law and the perception of land ownership developed and how it's different in one place versus the other. I think it's an important part of the whole big picture of surveying education.
Not so sure that the ancient surveying, like you said, Trent, the Egyptian surveying is quite as important to us as, like Jerry just said, the government system coming across the U.S. was so much more important to the way that you survey, the way so many of us survey. It's just the ancient survey. This is very interesting. It is a great class. It would make a great class, but it's just not quite as important to us as the government surveys are that affect the U.S.
Yeah, I'm a huge book. I'm a listener. I'm not a reader, but I'm a huge book person. One of my favorite books is Stephen Ambrose. Nothing Like It in the World. No, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about the Transcontinental Railroad. You guys ever seen or heard that book? That's fascinating. I like the history of that, right? And the how it was made and the railroad barons, and there's a lot of cool stuff. But my honestly, and it's not just because I'm a surveyor, but one of the coolest things is the surveying chapters in there, how they talk about laying it out, and they were reserving for themselves even sections, right? And the way they were able to control land. And the really cool thing for me, even going to the Egyptian one, we'll read a portion of this of how and why they did it, but it's amazing as you start looking at that and pulling on one of those strings, how how that affects everything else in our life, right? So, for example, let's just read through um, the civilization and land ownership pre-colonial surveys. It's this one right here. The king divided the land among all Egyptians so as to give each one a quadrangle of equal size and to draw from each his revenue, meaning the government's revenue, right, by imposing a tax to be levied yearly. But everyone from whose part the river tore anything away had to go to him to notify what had happened. He then sent overseers who measured out how much land had diminished in order that the owner might pay on what was left, in proportion to the entire tax imposed. In this way, it appears that geometry originated and passed thence to Hellas. But that's kind of a cool thought process as you kind of go down, okay, well, land is part of being taxed and the government, land is part of ownership. Land is part of inventing a system of math, meaning geometry. There's so much, and this is the cool thing about surveying for me, is how much of what we do affects everything else in life, and we don't even realize it. And explaining that to people, I'm kind of on this kick. So last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in a STEM fest, statewide STEM fest, talked to 15,000 students and tried to get them excited about what surveying is. And I've been spending the last 2 weeks since then talking to school districts about getting survey programs in the schools, in the high schools to elementary schools. And so it's kind of on my mind when I think about that. But to talk about that to a math class for half an hour, right? Look how surveying started this math that you're learning is, to me, it's fascinating, right? So there is definitely a point, to looking at this older stuff and then seeing how we got from A to B. The human body was the basic reference for the Egyptians. The following can be documented from history. So some cool little measurements there. A thumb breadth, 1/12 foot Roman inch. It's cool to know how we got to our measurements to the foot we have today, right? And even with that, understanding the measurements that were used. I know we're all probably aware of the state plane coordinate system of whatever year might actually come out. But right now, Utah is a U.S. survey foot state, but North Dakota, Arizona, a couple other states, I think Michigan is too. They are international foot states. You know the history of that. Well, right now, this new state plane coordinate system is going to be based off of, if I understand it correctly, the international foot, which Utah state law says that surveys must be performed in the current state plane coordinate system. Granted, they're ignoring that NAD 83 is based on the meter, but do we start then shifting to an international foot state plane coordinate measuring system? And 20, 30 years from now, are we going to have a similar class like this that says, in the 2020s, we made this shift and you got to know what side of the state plane coordinate system you're surveying on. We're kind of being part of history, part of this story we're looking at right now, just because of, in Utah, state laws, right? But you've got to know that history, and we've got to teach that and that change that's happening.
Well, what's interesting, you brought up meter. We have two definitions of the meter. In the 1890s, there was I think it was iridium rod given to us by France. And that was the definition of the U.S. survey foot. And then in the 50s, they came through and did a wave pattern based upon the light wave. And that became the international meter. And I know that's what they're wanting to go to, is the international meter. So when you hear meter, then you got to go, okay, which meter are we talking about? And that's the history. If you don't know that the other meter existed, then where you at?
they have a third meter also, which is 1/40th of a length, 1/40,000th of the length of a quarter length of Greenwich Meridian.
which was what the original definition was of the meter. And then all the effort that went into trying to determine that accurately.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the one I learned in school, the
Yeah.
40,000th of a meridian.
How many of us are Bible readers then too, right? The history of that shown through the Bible, right? So this was where they actually spent quite a bit of time on this. I've skimmed the Bible. I'm definitely a religious person, but never thought of it from a survey.
I think kind of one of the appreciations that you could walk away with from the information in this chapter, going back to the rope structures in the Bible, is that people seem to hold the measurement and the knowledge of where their land was in greater esteem than they do today, as far as measuring it out and having, surveyors come out and actually measure, determine where things are. Those are greater connection to the actual dimensions that a person owned of land, as opposed to, over to the fence there and to the tree over there type of thing.
The surveyor was held to a higher esteem also because of that.
Yeah.
Is that our fault or just a change in public priorities? Let's wax philosophical here, I guess.
I think it's some of both, because in other countries, surveyors are still held in pretty high esteem, and that seems to have changed a little bit in the US. It's kind of backsliding into the trade level of trades, as we all know.
Yeah, I believe I agree with what she's saying there. It is falling into the trades a little bit. The fight back from the perspective of like the state level, like the people that are representing us as a profession, they're still requiring a 4-year degree to become licensed in the area I'm in, at least, in order to preserve that and promote professionalism. To provide a requirement in order to be able to do what we do at the accuracies we are doing.
I think part of it is this country has industrialized and developed very fast, and to a degree, you had to solve a problem of having enough people skilled at certain things to keep up with it in industrialization. And then that became the norm. You get this phenomenon that's called a brand dilution that you hear about in marketing, when a lot of people start doing certain things to the level that it just becomes a common knowledge or a commonality. Like, the way, I don't know if Xerox actually lost their brand or was in jeopardy to losing the brand because they were so popular that Xerox became a name for a photocopy rather than the brand name. So in surveying, we had such a large influx of people that had to be ready to do the job fast, that resources weren't available to put them through the what I call classical education. And now we have these unintended consequences that surveying is being looked at more as a trade, because you're getting fewer and fewer classically educated professionals who have a much more rounded knowledge, to a point that we're in such a minority that you almost, to a degree, have to act a little bit on the dumb side just to be accepted, so that you're cool enough to be hanging out with the majority of the people. and not get too uppity. So I don't know how to solve the problem, but that's
the bigger
my
problem.
2 cents on it.
I don't think we was trying to go this direction with this conversation, but I think the bigger problem is the idea that construction companies have a bigger budget and availability to hire the people that are like able to do that work, and they're hiring those people and pulling them away from the industry. And they're actually,
Mhm.
that's why it's becoming more trade wise, and why actual surveyors that are able to comprehend and understand and finalize the information, and be able to understand the difference between all these different situations, different, like all these different measurements types. Technology is bringing that more to a technology or technical side rather than a knowledge side.
Yeah, and that's what's happening currently. Yeah, yeah. The
And we can't
the-
afford to we can't afford to pay those people to stay here either. So there's that
Mhm.
problem.
Well, here's a great
Because a survey on a ground is way cheaper than an actual development.
Here's a great example of that. I've got a home builder developer that we've worked with for a long time, and this will bring it back kind of in our measurement discussion. But they got big enough that they bought a GPS, and now they're staking out all their own homes. Luckily, we built kind of a rapport with these guys, but the guy that's doing it, you know, they're buying up like a papered subdivision from another developer, you know, a different engineer did it, and now they're staking off of someone else's plans too. And he doesn't know how to get his equipment localized on this lot. So he's calling me all the time, this survey technician that doesn't even understand how the GPS works and the measurements of it. You know, and so we look at the screen here and we look at these ancient measurements, but you know, you carry that through time. Surveyors are expert measurers, putting these dimensions on the ground. And this kid, bless his heart, I mean, he is able, smart, capable. He'd make a really great licensed surveyor if I could ever pull him over. But this company's paying him a ton of money to go stake houses, and he's got a pretty cush job. He's got a GPS that does it for him. He plugs in some coordinates. The problem is he doesn't understand when the measurement's wrong, right? And so looking at let's pull it back. Love the discussion. I could go here all day, but pulling it back to kind of history and surveying and history and measurements, you know, we have to know when, you know, it says 40 rods or 80 chains, you know, the history of what a chain was and how it was measured, and we miss it by 5 feet. Well, an expert surveyor knows, well, that's no big deal. They were pulling that across the ravine, and, you know, of course they missed it by 5 feet, but your measurer, your technician does not, oh, we missed it by 5 feet, something screwed up, or maybe even worse, they miss it by 5 feet, don't notice it, and screw something up.
So you're saying when it's easy to know what's going on, but when something goes wrong, what do you do?
yeah,
Hire a surveyor.
troubleshooting,
Right.
having the depth of knowledge to troubleshoot and understand other scenarios and intelligently parse what to do and what not to do.
It's easy to be a high-paid button pusher. But yeah, what do you do when it goes wrong?
And they
I
call
like
you.
Early in my career, you know, I was wondering, I did a lot of retracement for the county surveyor, and figuring out, you know, why is this section 60 feet longer? It says 80 chains, but you know, I'm sitting there at 5340. You know, why is that? You know, why am I getting into that? And I started buying chains to see what they were, and I found one chain I had was 67.1 feet long. That equates to 88 feet in a mile. So you can understand, you know, and that's why you got to know the history. A chain, a gunner's chain, which is 66 feet long, has over 600 wear points, you know, where the metal rubs against each other. And metal has a memory because they always go back to that point and wear a little more. And you can take like a 1/28 of an inch at each wear point, and it equates to quite a few feet. You know, and understanding that, and you know, of course, we all know, okay, we got to get into his chain versus my chain. In this case, would be GPS, and where to find the next corner. You know, I got to, you know, try to, you know, match, see what's going on. And then there's other, you know, other problems that, you know, that you don't talk about. You know, that they could drop a chaining pin, they could report the wrong distance. We have all that, but then you got to have the knowledge to, what am I looking for? I'm looking for a stone. You know, is there any stones? What's his mound of stone? But I think it's, you know, getting knowledge of what we're looking for. And that's why, especially in the PLSS stage, you have to understand what they were setting and some of their shortcuts. Because they were paid by the mile. And believe me, they did not follow the manual at all. I mean, in their retracement, if they could herringbone it and just stub out a quarter corner, they did. And in California, we have the Buffing or the Benson and Glover.
Benson
Benson
Syndicate.
Syndicate, yeah. And you know, I've been up against it. I've been up where I found the stuff, and I've been up against it where I didn't find the stuff. You know, there was a book that was written, it's called Chaining the Land by Bud Uzez. Bud's real name's Francois, but he lists the fraudulent surveys, what contract number they were in his first book. And then when he printed his second book, there was a judge, I believe in Monterey County, listed all these other townships that were fraudulent. So you just got to know where you're working, what contract you're under, or what they were set under, to see what you're going to find, if you're going to find something. But you always got to look. Even though it's deemed fraudulent, you got to make it look. Then you got to say, okay, I agree with them that it is fraudulent.
So I when I lived in Wisconsin, I was working getting licensed in Iowa, and I pulled my books here. These are all on their state website, but Iowa is another one of those that has a bunch of different manuals of instruction that cover as they went west across the state. So I've got 3 books. This is original instructions governing public lands, 1815 to 1855, and then these don't have the dates on the outside. A guide to use in the resurvey of public lands, but these govern Iowa's, and trust me, their state test definitely covers all the different instructions they have for theirs. So knowing the history, knowing, you know, not just what company was doing it, but what version of the manual was covering that is critical.
Well, what you have an interesting dilemma in Wisconsin where it came to subdivision of sections down into adequate parts. For about a 12-year period in the late 1850s through the early 1870s, we had variations of the location of the center of section that differed from what the manual of instruction said. At one point, we started out with the opposite quarter corner connections. Then we went to equidistant east-west, and that's where it was located. Then we went to equidistant east-west and north-south. Then we went back to equidistant east-west, and then we went back to the federal method, all in about a 12-year period. So because there was such a short time frame, and it was the 1860s, who knows what they were using out in the field. So part of being a surveyor in an area is you learn what the surveyors did based on their reputation. So when you see a survey that was done by Murphy, yeah, Murphy was very meticulous. He followed this. This is the way he always did stuff. Even though he may have not documented it that way, we traced this stuff before it was good. You see another guy's name, you know, that's going to be a problem. But when you go through that rapid growth, like the stuff in Iowa that you're talking about, you can't be sure that because the survey was done in a particular year, that it followed that latest set of instructions. The guy that may have been doing it could have started a contract back before and just stuck with what he was doing in the previous times and that type of thing. So that's always one of those things. It's a very regional type of thing.
The other thing on that same matter is just because the instructions came out on this date doesn't mean that they didn't write it from horseback to the next person. And it didn't take 2 months to get it to the next person. Or more.
In
Oh,
1860,
fair points.
I was going to say in the
Thank you.
manual of 1861, which was just a pamphlet, that's where they went to the intersections of the 4 quarter corners. And but in the 1870s, a deputy county surveyor, Schlobel Clevenger, wrote a book, and he went from west to east on the split. And I have books in my library that show double centers of section, and they divided by acreage. The south half was divided equally, and the north half was divided equally. And I believe that book was written in 1934. You know, so it's your mentors in the past, and also, you know, what books are being taught out of that can get frustrating to you.
I love this discussion. I haven't heard of the acreage split before. That's a new one for me. That's interesting.
Yeah, what I can do is I can copy it and send it out. I'll send it to you, Trent,
Great.
and show you the pay, you know, so you can see what it is and stuff. So
Jumping back over to the book here, there's I just want to point out this part. I love this refinement into smaller units that we kind of have up on the screen here. This 12 human hairs to 1 poppy seed, 4 poppy seeds to 1 barley corn. And if you calculate that out, it's 9 million and change human hairs to a mile. Love it. It's great. Surveying's the best. We have a saying here in my office, because I'll play into it a little bit with our engineers that always complain about surveyors, but I always say surveyors are the worst. And you know why we're the worst? It's crap like that, but you got to retrace. But I love it. It's great. The book goes from Greeks, sovereignty and ownership, feudal systems. I'm not even sure how to say that last word. Livery of Season. Statutes of frauds. Early property surveys in the New World. This is really kind of cool thing.
And now you're getting into historical stuff that has a direct impact on the things that are happening, that happen in this country now. Because you look back at the feudal system, a lot of the terminology we have today goes back to them. Landlord, tenant, fees, rents, that type of thing, leases. And then when you get into unwritten rights, that was the person who was supposed to defend his rights as owner of the land. He was expected to do that. So now you're getting into that type of historical aspect that even though it predates the type of measurements we make today in our public land survey system, it still has an impact on land ownership in this country.
Well, and you have to remember the book we're reading, and we're talking about measurements in a specific chapter, but when we open up the wider picture, what we're trying to accomplish is we're talking about determining a boundary, right? We're talking about the judicial side or quasi-judicial side of surveying. So you have to understand the law that governed it at the time it was created. You know, and it goes back to some of those other chapters we've discussed, but to Jerry's point, that is what this book is about. We can get into the weeds about the funds of measurement, but at the end of the day, you have to know how that land was created. You know,
Yeah, and you look at the measurement aspect of it, and that's where a lot of the younger surveyors are getting tied up into what's the technology today. If you look at the rules of construction, the measurements are actually down quite a ways below unwritten rights, senior rights, interpreting of the description. The actual measurements and stuff are lower down on that list.
Yeah, the way I've always understood it, it's the intent that is the main thing for the most part, and the directions and distances are adjectives to describe how to get to that point. Once you find the actual monumentation, the original monumentation, that is what is key. Is that correct or incorrect, or?
Yeah, for the most part, but again, the intent is got to be secondary to any other higher claims, and among those higher claims are unwritten rights. And if the intent infringes on a higher right, like a junior and senior situation, then that has to yield also. So yeah, the intent, written intent is important, but there's a couple of things above it that based on owner actions or adjacent owner actions can overrule that.
I think it was John Stahl back in the day when he used to do classes, like the Utah Council Land Surveyors Conference or something I attended. I'm pretty sure it was him. I'm going to blame him because he's not here, but you'd ask those questions and his answer was always, well, it depends.
It does.
As a young surveyor, that's the most frustrating thing to try. I'm trying to learn this so I can go out and do my own survey. You know, Brian, you said you're a construction surveyor and that's been most of your stuff, and you're trying to learn how do I determine a property. Well, unfortunately, it depends on so much. But I think that's why books like this and this forum here is so great, because we can bring up some of those it depends, or we can build relationships to run those ideas past other people and not be on our own in answering that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of books talk about a generalized hierarchy of evidence that we find in boundaries, and that it goes from junior rights, senior rights to my brain just stopped. Anyway, the full hierarchy of things, you can generalize it, but then when you apply this to any specific case, every boundary survey now has its own hierarchy of what has happened at what point in time, who did what monuments they set at what time, and you kind of have to follow how the whole area got created from the beginning up to the present time to understand, in most cases, to understand what to do with it, because some of the items on hierarchy of evidence can flip-flop their directions depending on how they interact with the other elements in your single boundary system. So it takes quite a bit of effort to go through it and establish all those relationships and paint a picture of what happened, and then how to justify what you held and what you didn't hold, and why you did what you did, which piece of evidence took precedent over something else, and what the reasoning was.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Jumping over here again to the book, Early Property Surveys. The methodology of surveying remained fairly constant in New York, in the New World, from the time of exploration until 1776, when a unique metamorphosis took place. The earliest surveys in the New World were to map the country rather than to delineate properties and their accompanying boundaries. Information for suitable homestead land was quite meager, and surveyors were needed to explore and map rivers and other waterways that were the natural means of travel or the highways. Among the surveyors sent to Virginia to locate land allotments was William Claiborne, who in 1621, at the age of 38, was paid £20 per annum and furnished with a house. In 1629, for his part in defeating the Indians, he was granted a tract of land on the Pamunkey River. And then, let's see, it says they had various types of backgrounds. Some were astronomers, mathematicians, such as Mason and Dixon. Talks about, the caliber. We talked about a little bit more, right? Earlier, the caliber of surveyors. This book definitely points that out. Most of these surveyors were influential, perhaps wealthy people that could afford to do school, could afford to get into math. George Washington was appointed official county surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia, but was not a registered county surveyor. Culpeper was a new county, and George was its first surveyor. His duties mainly consisted of marking out small farms for settlers, as well as land for some wealthy Virginia landowners. George's grandfather, Colonel John Washington, came to Virginia with wealth and influence. Although he purchased large tracts of lands, the wealth of the Washington family soon dissipated. George was brought up at Mount Vernon, where it is supposed that he learned the art of land surveying from his half brother, Lawrence Washington. George's surveying practice, as such, lasted only about 2 years. During this time, he used his position to further his land speculation and to locate lands for some of the wealthy Virginia plantation owners. The principal one being Thomas Fairfax in Shenandoah Valley. In 1751, George and Lawrence joined the British Army against the insurgent French. While in the Army, George was able to obtain title to 32,000 acres in West Virginia from other officers. With land speculation in full swing, he sent an agent to England to promote buyers for his tracts. Being very shrewd businessman and having the advantage of being a surveyor, Washington built a large fortune in land. By the time he died in 1779, his holdings included 49,000 acres in the rich Kanawha River Valley of West Virginia, as well as vast tracts in Virginia, New York, Ohio, and other places. So I think that goes to what we were saying before is the caliber of people we had doing this, were people that could afford some education, understood math. They weren't, if you will, your run-of-the-mill high school graduate pounding hammers on a survey crew, right? These guys there was a lot that went into it, and they understood that. Not to knock those, if there's any people on here, I don't mean to disparage those that are coming up or anything like that when I say that, but there's definitely a different caliber breed of surveyors of these guys that grew up starting it. In colonial days, direction was usually determined by magnetic compass, which is a bearing measurement we have yet to talk about today. Star observations were made to check the variation in the needle. The solar compass did not come into use until about 1835. Straight lines were run with pickets by a succession of compass readings or by the circumferentor, a French instrument in general use until about 1800. And it talks about how Mason-Dixon kind of did theirs and how they got so precise in theirs. But a circumferentor and the chain there, Gunter chain. Then we get into the concept of area, tidal. This is the stuff that really matters now when we look at determining a boundary. Modern concepts of land ownership have developed from Christianity and feudalism. Fee tail ownership evolved from absentee ownership and feudalism. Fee simple ownership at first was reserved for the favored few. Title may be defined as the legal basis or grounds for land ownership and may be transferred by descent through heirs or by purchase according to the law. The conveyances include that acquired not only by buying but also by device, will, grant, adverse possession, the sheet, condemnation, and numerous other ways that land title can be transferred. And this is kind of my complaint about the book or surveying is, we're talking about locating ownership on the ground, locating a deed on the ground, and it's very hard. And the book tries to start by separating ownership and title, right, and who it is, but by simply placing points on the ground, we are making some sort of opinion on that, whether we mean to or not. But they're so tied, even in measurement, putting that measurement on the ground. Survey systems of the east and south, so origin of title. I don't want to just sit here and read it, but we've kind of talked about some of this. But I mean, English, Dutch, French, Spanish, Mexican, and even Russian grants have been upheld in America. And the title going back to these sovereign nations reflect the system or lack of one imposed by custom or royal decree. Anyone experienced a Russian grant? That was a new one to me reading through this chapter. like to hear someone that's had to deal with that one. That would be a cool history lesson there.
We got anybody from Alaska?
Northern California.
No?
Is there some in Northern Cal?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there we go. Shaded states are without public domain, a rectangular system. Hawaii is not shown here, but obviously they have their own system too. Surveying in the early states, and this is where it gets really interesting. Kind of this round table discussion we've been having is starting at the like in Ohio and Virginia areas where these systems were first tested out, and then moving out in all directions. It's changed and morphed as they've learned and um, adjusted the system. So Virginia, New England. In New Hampshire, a surveyor of a highway and fence of highways and a fence viewer were elected to locate new roads, settle fence arguments, and perambulate town boundaries. Caleb Brown served in both posts and settled on Lot 92 about the same time of the Revolutionary War. In addition to locating the lots in New England, the surveyor usually judged the quality of the land. 4 lots usually have an overrun area. 10% overrun is not uncommon. Surveyors' assistants, as well as chainmen, were under oath and returned a report about what was done. The plan and description, in addition to Alexandria, New Hampshire, contained in this note. So that was another interesting thing. Is not only were they looking at boundaries and roads, but often these early surveyors were talking about the quality of the land. And I guess we still do that to some extent. If we're doing engineering surveys, the quality of the land, the ability to improve on it within local regulations. Kind of cool to connect those two, right? That we're still doing that. Just gives a bunch of stories about old surveyors and how they did and what they did. And if someone wants to stop and read through one of these, let me know. So I'm not just kind of going through it here, but Connecticut, Rhode Island. Rhode Island, settled by Roger Williams and followers in 1636. The small area was granted charter by King Charles II in 1663. The description calls for natural objects, recite meets and bounds, and was originally included in the Charles I grant to Connecticut. Although some dispute developed over location of the boundaries, the state never had to claim Western lands. Today, several of these original boundaries are in question. I think North Carolina and Georgia both have some boundary questions. I think if you go back through old POB or American Surveyor magazines, they've got quite a few articles about trying to retrace and establish those corners. In more recent history in the news, the Four Corners area in southeastern Utah has come to some notoriety that someone made claim that corner was off. But as the surveyor understands, the corner was set, and so it is not off. It is where it is. So some interesting things. The history of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Carolina, Georgia. We want to stop at any of these land systems in Georgia. I think this is going to be a lot like Brian's example in Ohio, some of the different areas and measuring systems there. Subdivision we read all through Ohio. Prior land grants in the Louisiana territory. Prior to purchase of Louisiana in 1803, the French and Spanish grants were made extensively along the tributary rivers to the lower Mississippi. Many French land grants called for a certain number of arpents. 1 arpent equals 191.8 feet, fronting on a river or bayou extending back 40 to 80 arpents. Although the frontage on the water was usually definite, The direction and depth were often vague and indefinite. Land was plentiful, and the back portion was often swampy and unimportant. So if you're working in those areas, it's kind of important to know. Um, History of the Southwest, Spanish origin, seniority of titles. And I know you guys are kind of talking about some of this. Rights included with Spanish and Mexican grants. Minerals, Spanish water laws, 1958. This is one I was starting to look into because it was so kind of recent, at least the date on here, and trying to get an understanding of that, but I didn't quite get through what all that meant there. Anyone had to deal with Spanish water laws? I know a few weeks ago we had someone in from Texas here. It'd be too bad he's not on here to kind of help talk us through some of that. Roadbeds, early settlements, Ordenanza de Intendentes, the impresario system within the state of California, state of Coahuila in Texas. The impresario system of colonization was established. The impresario was given land in exchange for bringing in families, and each impresario was given a specific area in which to operate. Until 1820, the U.S. Congress sold land at $2 per acre, whereas in Texas it was much less. Texas grew rapidly, and about 1/7 of Texas was alienated by Spanish and Mexico up until the time of independence. In some Texas surveys, after some county boundary lines were created by running in the field, there was an attempt to try to adopt the GLO system of surveys by creating sections, townships, and range on a limited basis. Apparently, these were done under the auspices of the Texas General Land Office, but few land descriptions reference these surveys in modern land descriptions. So, Texas tried out the PLSS, it looks like. Suits against the sovereign. The king or sovereign cannot be brought to court without his consent. That is, the king can do no wrong. To straighten out many of the Texas title problems, the Texas legislature passed enabling acts allowing the citizen to bring title suits against the state. At various times, the legislature of Texas passed laws voiding titles not recorded as of a specific date, but such acts were declared in a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Some really cool stuff. Instructions to surveyors. Surveys of Spanish and Mexican land grants. Gradient boundary. In the Red River case of Oklahoma versus Texas, the Supreme Court of the United States declared in an unprecedented action that the boundary between Oklahoma and Texas was to be determined by the medial line between gradient lines on each bank. Prior authority for such rule did not exist. Kind of cool case there. Effective Native Americans. The accuracy of early surveys was sometimes in inverse proportion to the density of the native population. Indians were well aware that settlers soon followed the surveyor. By exterminating the surveyors and the results of their surveys, the Indians believed they could prevent the stealing of their land. Field notes and letters express concern of the troubles the surveyors encountered with various tribes from Florida to New Mexico. Native Americans tried their best to keep surveyors from doing their job. Standard survey equipment included chains, axes, compasses, rifles, and pistols. Constant vigilance to avoid surprise attacks caused anxiety. No wonder occasional chain links were forgotten and corners falling in forbidden thickets were not set. Captain Bartlett Sims' survey party in 1846 was surprised by Indians, and 3 of the 4 were killed. A party of 10 surveying along the Guadalupe River in Texas was attacked and all were killed. Captain John Every's survey party of 10 had 3 killed in 1839. In 1838, Henderson's survey party, about 25, was attacked by Kickapoo Indians in Texas history. This is called the Surveyor's Fight. 18 were probably killed and 7 escaped. In Indian country, bobtail surveys were not uncommon. The surveyor set 1 or 2 corners and calculated the remainder. California history.
Just for fun here real quick.
Yeah.
Early Indiana Trails and Surveys, the book that I was reading there not too long ago, they talk about the same type of thing happened, only it was black panthers killing the surveyors as they traverse through the state.
Really interesting.
it's crazy because I've never seen one in my life, and yet they're not prevalent here now. But yet it talks about the same thing: panthers killing surveyors amongst the Indians, by the way.
Talk about hazard pay, right? I complain when I've got to just go along the side of the highway there.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. There's some really cool history, early California history. The coast of California was the object of search for a shortcut to the Orient. Balboa in 1513 claimed the Pacific shores in the name of the King of Spain. Cabrillo stopped at San Diego Bay in 1542. The Spanish government discontinued exploration of the California area after Villechano's voyage in 1603. So it goes through some pretty cool stuff there. We won't give that too much because you guys all know that, right? All our California guys already know that history, so we don't need to reteach you it. Resurvey land grants the public domain, units of measurement. Again, this is the kind of the cool thing. Here's an arpent, right? And a bunch of different measurements for what the arpent might equate to. And this, I think, is the end of the chapter here. Summary. Let's see how much we keep going here. So, the public domain or GLO, getting into the history of that. The Ordinance of 1785. Task Committee chaired by Thomas Jefferson created a draft ordinance for the Land Office of the United States. So here's the beginning of the PLSS system. Principal sources of land to the public domain. Some pretty cool stuff in here. Prior surveys, survey of the 7 ranges. Introduce a system of prior surveys, that is, surveys prior to settling lands. Geographer of the United States. Beginning survey of the 7 ranges. Ordinance 1796. So these are all then a bunch of those acts that start creating the PLSSS. Surveyor General. Here is a map of the rectangular survey systems. So Utah, we do have, this is the Uinta Basin. It's kind of an Indian reservation type area there that has its own base in Meridian. California's got, you were saying there was more. I think Connie was saying that. Is this area here kind of another one, or what do we see there in California?
Yeah, that's the Mount Diablo Basin Meridian right up there. And we're down in Southern California with San Bernardino is one that she was talking about. And then you have Humboldt Meridian up there. Yep.
What Connie was mentioned was that there were 3 initial points for San Bernardino
For San
Basin
Bernardino.
Meridian. Mount Diablo, there's 2 points there. And then Humboldt, there's only 1 point that was established, and it's still the only point there.
Alaska there. Introductions, deputies, Tiffin's instructions. I don't want to go through this because it's all kind of just, I don't want to say it's dry history stuff, but it's definitely dry history stuff. So kind of scroll through here, see if
It's all
else.
Ohio stuff.
Later instructions, reorganizing the land office. The General Land Office, established in 1812, was reorganized July 4th, 1836. The contract system of subdividing lands began with the Act of 1796 and was abolished in 1910 when a form of civil service was adopted. In 1946, the General Land Office and the Grazing Service were combined to form the Bureau of Land Management under the Department of the Interior. This agency employs professional cadastral surveyors who use the latest methods and equipment to locate and subdivide public domain. Much of their present activity is in the state of Alaska, although there is considerable amount of unsurveyed land in the western states. In 1973, the BLM published a manual of instruction that is presently in effect. A new manual is now being written. That is interesting because this version, didn't this just come out last year, right? Didn't we say that? What's the date on this? The 7th edition, just a couple years ago, right? bring up my book itself. 2021. So we've got our 2019 manual, or 2009 manual. Excuse me. Right. So they don't even talk about that one, at least in that paragraph.
And the manual that you held up is a pain to read because it's so heavy. You go back to 73, it's much lighter. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Well, the 73 was, I mean, most copies are the paperback copy, right?
Yeah, I got a hardbound copy of it,
Okay.
and it's the paper. It's real thin, and when you have it in your lap, I just see the new manual's just too heavy. That thing's a pain to read. Not a pain to read, but it's just having to deal with the weight of it, as crazy as it sounds. But I've made a habit. I've collected all the manuals back to 55, and I have a copy of the 51 manual because you don't know what you're running up against when retracement. What were their instructions?
Yeah,
So you
for
got to
those,
know
yeah.
the history of their survey and what they were to do, and then you can compare it to today's manual.
Yeah, for those of you that don't have access to those older manuals or can't track them down, C.A. White's book on the history of the public land survey system has all the instructions from Tiffin's all the way forward. And that is available for free in PDF version on the training center site for the Bureau of Land Management. You got that there, Trent? Is that what you have? Grab?
So I've got this one here.
Yeah, you got the binder version of it. I've got the old hard copy when that first came out, which you can't find anymore. But they do have the PDF version, and they do have some of the older manuals in PDF version on that training site also.
Yeah, pull those ones up, get them saved on your network on your computer somewhere so you can go back through them. Let's see. Yeah, so just going through this, the rest of this just goes through a lot of these manuals. Manual 1973, Protection Program, Republic Land, Timber Culture Act, Classification of National Forest Lands. There's a lot of really cool stuff here that's kind of maybe one off if you're dealing with them or if you don't have to deal with it. But it's nice to know that these are here so we can go to them. Land ownership in Hawaii. That's the one I want to kind of talk about too, because that's a unique one. Captain James Cook discovered the Hawaiian Islands in 1778 and named them for the Earl of Sandwich. These eight inhabited islands were well populated by people who lived under a strict feudal system. The land belonged to the king, who doled it out to his chiefs. The Great Mahele of 1846 was a homestead reform that gave much of the public land to the people. Title entries were made in the Mahele Book, and titles of property today refer to this record. The United States annexed Hawaii on July 7, 1898. The act stated to cede and transfer to the United States the absolute fee and ownership of all public government or crown lands. It was further provided that the existing laws of the United States relative to public lands shall not apply to such lands in the Hawaiian Islands, but the Congress of the United States shall enact special laws for their management and disposition. At the present time, public land is about 40% of the land area of the 8 inhabited islands. In 1920, the Hawaii Homes Commission was created to grant 99-year land leases to persons who were not less than 1/2 Hawaiian by blood. Two systems of land registration are practiced in Hawaii, a recorder system and the land court. About 40% of the island in Oahu, containing Honolulu, and about 8% of the remaining lands are registered in the land court. A lot and block system tied to a rectangular grid system is used in the land court. The recorder system has many of its tracts described in metes and bounds. As a matter of historical interest, one should read the decision Midcal v. Hawaii Housing Authority in order to become acquainted with the history of Hawaiian lands. Land in Alaska. Alaska was discovered by Vitus Bering on July 16, 1741, while he was on a Russian expedition in search of fur. A Russian-American company followed With the establishment of small coastal settlements, Russia sold the entire claim to the United States in 1867 when virtually all the territory was vacant public land. The federal acts pertaining to the dispossession and management of public lands apply to Alaska. At the present time, slightly more than half of the public domain is situated in this state. Under the statehood land grant, Alaska is to acquire 103 million acres in its period of 25 years. Alaska was an active area of homesteading, but this no longer applies. Many oil, gas, and mineral leases have been located in Alaska, and title surveying is active. Court reports, the necessity of legal history, and some cases there. So that's it for this chapter. There's definitely a lot that kind of gets skimmed over there, but a lot of great history to dig into. Any other comments, stories, examples, questions to kind of throw out there? Discussion to have? I don't know. For my favorite chapter, we lost quite a few people through the hour here, so a few drop off. So apparently, this isn't as exciting as some of us think. But
What I find, especially here in California, I'm out of Kern County, and I tend to stay in Kern County. I don't tend to go to other counties because things are different in other counties. I have done some research in the previous surveys in other counties, and I don't care for it. So I just stay in my county, Kern County, where I know the old surveyors in the retracement. Whenever I find a corner, I immediately look up the LS number I find, and I know plenty of them by mind. I know who I'm retracing on, and when I find a corner, I said, "Oh, that's so and so." His corners are good. He did make mistakes, but he did a lot of surveys. So, I think that in each of the surveyors here, I mean, you've done different states, and when you get in there, you got training to do to figure out what the history is. You got a lot of reading to go on. So,
yeah, are you just out of curiosity? Are you a survey only gig? Are you tied to engineers at all, or?
I'm retired now, and
Well, yeah.
I go out 2-3
See how
times a
long
week.
that lasts.
And yeah, when does a surveyor retire? But I only go out 2-3 times a week, and I work about 6 hours, and it's all boundary. I don't do construction. Yeah, I am tied to an engineer, but only when he needs a boundary for his construction that I do it. And then he has to hire somebody to do the construction surveying. I move on.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's the hardest part of kind of this history part, right? Is, I cover, just as a general area, about 5 counties, the northern third of Utah. But I work for I'll say a statewide engineering company. We do a lot for private developers, school district, government work, right? So often my work direction or location is determined by where our developer has bought his next piece of land and prefers us to do it, right? So for that fact, we've got a couple of our staff surveyors are licensed in neighboring states because our clients have asked us to do it. Idaho being one of those that is, they are very tricky. I mean, they're very similar to Utah, those that are local to this area. I call Idaho Little Utah because it just is. They're just our baby brother up there. But they are very strict on filing corner records. You go hit a section corner, even if there's a recent corner record, if someone finds out that you went to that corner, used it for your survey, and didn't file a corner record saying you used that one and found it in the same condition as the last one, you might get dinged by their licensing board. But you got to know that, right? So our survey that's licensed up there, he's very careful about, okay, if we're going up there, make sure you remember all this and do it. But you know, we've learned some of that probably by sad experience, because that's where our clients want us to go. I know that's the challenge of working for like an engineering firm. I know we've got a couple governments guys, that's really easy because you kind of have your purview, right? And but and then you know we do have just those survey only firms that you can be, I'll almost say, a little bit more picky about where you work, right? You can choose that you're not going out of a certain geographical area or comfort zone. Um, so it's important to know and understand where you're working, but there's a lot even just in, and I've given my complaints about the different counties I work in. County to county, it's very different.
Just going back to something that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier. I mean, there was the idea of the different coordinate systems that are available and this and that. Like at least where I live, we're getting ready to start. I'm not real sure exactly when it's supposed to occur, but they're going to create all these new LDPs, low distortion projections, countywide projections for every county that is in the state of Ohio. The combination of that on top of the upcoming NatRef 2022. That's going to be a whole different horizontal reference frame that replaces NAT 83. So understanding the progression of how these systems come forth and being able to label them properly on your survey to say what reference frame and this and that, where it came from, for future surveyors to be able to come behind you and follow that and make the proper corrections to get to where you were. Those are important.
It is. We've got a unique problem in Utah is those low distortion projections, because we've got such vertical relief across the state. We're going to have very specific areas that aren't even county-wide, right? A mountain range or a canyon range, very small. Here's this low distortion, so we can fit this vertical relief in those areas. So we're going to have a heck of a time trying to learn and understand that. But the way I do it is I'm still a 5,000 surveyor. I mean, state law requires, we've got some other kind of things that throw a wrench in that when we go to platting. But I'm a 5,000, and then historic bearings on section lines, So I'm not even doing anything state plan or even dealing with any of that reference system at all.
We got to remember that regardless what the spatial reference system becomes, where it evolves to, we're still expressing on our maps and then our descriptions distances and directions. We're not expressing things in terms of coordinates, nor do I think we should in terms of coordinates, because of the dynamic nature of coordinate systems. Plus, clients aren't going to understand coordinates. You're not going to be able to have anybody visualize what a piece of land looks like that's described by coordinates. Ultimately, it's monuments on the ground and the measurements in between them at ground level that are still going to be controlling the way we interpret and define where the boundaries are. So coordinates are nice, and they're great for the GIS and all that kind of stuff, but those are the people that aren't on the ground. Okay, the surveyors are the ones that are on the ground along with the clients.
I would 100% agree.
I
with
went
that
after a
entire
city
situation.
surveyor. I'll go ahead, Jim, Brian.
Sorry. The only thing I was going to say was I would 100% agree with Jerry in that situation. The only thing is you start to become you're starting to see GIS systems. Well, the GIS systems are run by the county, which is a governmental organization, which means they're starting to overstep their bounds and put more information requirements on all your plats and descriptions to make their life easier. Let's put it that way. Let's be nice.
I'm seeing that here. So we talked about 4 weeks ago about Utah is now requiring electronic recordings of plats, for example. So along with that recording of what used to be a Mylar plat signed by everybody is they're asking for the CAD file, electronic, right? So they can do their GIS system, and trying to play ball and help them figure that out. I sent them my plat and they about lost it because it was, again, it was 5,000, not 2 million. And
we don't have as large a terrain variation here in Wisconsin as you do in Utah and some of the other western states. But we've had low distortion coordinate systems for over 20 years. Each county's got its own coordinate system. And those are developed in conjunction with the land information community and the surveying community. So there's a working relationship between those two. These new low distortion coordinate systems are being developed by the NGS. We've got a task group within Wisconsin that consists of people from the surveying community and the land information community that are giving direct input to the NGS on the design of those systems. So what you got to do is, if you're not doing it right now, be very proactive in that respect. The NGS sent out information, they wanted feedback from users about that, to how to develop these systems. So if you get the communities working together, then these additional requirements that they start to put on surveyors for them, they'll at least make sense for both the surveying and the land information community. So we're not at loggerheads with respect to each other all the time.
Utah's doing the same thing. We've got a task force under the UCLS that's doing that and giving feedback.
When I do state plane coordinates and the county requests my files, I move them. I take all my line work and I move it elsewhere. So I don't give them any of my data where the things are. And they say it doesn't fit. And I said, well, it fits the ground. That's where your concern is. So.
Yeah, well, and anyone that's, smart enough to take that should then look at section, if you're trying to create a database, section corners. And
if you go back to the measurements, I keep telling people this all the time. If you save the measurements, who cares what coordinate system you're on? Then it's a mathematical reduction. But if all you've got are coordinates, that's a problem we have with going from 27 to 83, is people had coordinates. They didn't have the measurements that those coordinates were derived from. So how do you get from those old coordinates on 27 to the new coordinates on 83 without introducing all sorts of distortion? If we'd have had the original measurements, all we would have done is reduce them to NAD 83 and bang, we would have been there. And in the surveying community, we've always operated that way. We save measurements. We make measurements. We put our descriptions in terms of measurements. The coordinates, they're at the very bottom of the rules of construction list for a reason. They're at the very bottom. They're not a controlling term. That's one of my soapboxes I get up on. I'm sorry. I get real passionate about this. Those of you that come to the seminar next week in Nevada, we're going to have deed interpretation, and I'm going to go off on a soapbox on these things even more. So
I'll finish off your soapbox here. I got into it with a city surveyor that was requiring me to put coordinates on all my property corners on a plat to get recorded at the county. And I told him in no uncertain terms that will not be happening, and he will have to find a way to approve my survey without that.
Make all the coordinates the same. Just give them all 5,000, 5,000 for every corner that's on there. So you want the coordinates? Here they are.
Well, he said it has to be in a state plane coordinate, so he wants to see something, and I said
3,000, 300,500. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why was he even, what was his reasoning? Did he ever explain?
Well, there was a history of interpreting county code that way. They've gotten away with it, but there's 2 or 3 cities that they're kind of all developed out, so they don't see too many plats in their subdivision or in their city limits. And so they go back to this code. The county was saying your plat should have coordinates on it. What the county meant to say was it should have bearings on it. These cities interpreted coordinates to be coordinates on the corners, and so you have an era of plats that actually have every property corner, section corner, whether it's tabled off to the side or noted on northing, easting, a state plane coordinate on there for a while. And I think Wisconsin even had some trouble where people were doing that, and then people would take that plat coordinate and stake it out, right? They would just pull it off the
You
recorded
bet, you
plat. Like it,
betcha, you betcha. And people, as soon as they got these little phone apps with the GPS apps and stuff, say, how come the maps that the county's got are all wrong? Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
It's instead of calling them northern and eastern, just call them, latitude and departure.
Yeah, there we go.
That'll get them.
Yeah. So no, I think I won that argument, but I should start recording before I say this part, but I'm things are getting difficult in the development side. It seems to get harder and harder, and I'm losing my patience with people that are unnecessarily making it hard. So I've started making my opinion more known when they're doing stupid stuff like that. And I'll leave it at that. How about that? Hey guys, I appreciate you being on here today. We're well over time. This has been a great discussion. This has probably been my most favorite chapter to go through. There's so much to take out of this and learn from. Like I said, a lot of it won't apply to maybe what I'll ever encounter, but there is so much good stuff in here. And yeah, take it, run with it, learn from it. And then next week, or in 2 weeks, we are recording and preserving evidence. I think these are getting easier and easier because we start going over stuff we've kind of talked about that keeps tying together, and we're on the downhill slope as we kind of take our evidence gathering and decision making and turn it into a real final survey. So with that, unless there's anything else, appreciate you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.